My daughter shoved me into the shed on a Tuesday afternoon and turned the key from the outside. At 74 years old, I didn't think I'd ever hear my own child say, "Scream all you want, nobody can hear you out here." But she said it, and the door closed, and for a moment I really did want to scream like an animal caught in a trap. Instead, I stood very still and listened to her footsteps on the gravel. Carla's heels clicked twice, then the sound softened when she stepped back onto the lawn. I imagined her smoothing her dress, wiping the anger off her face before going back into her lovely house with the big kitchen I helped pay for. It smelled of damp wood and fertilizer inside. The shed in their backyard was long and narrow, lined with shelves and plastic boxes. A sliver of light ran along the crack at the top of the door, dust floating through it like tiny ghosts. My heart was beating too fast, making my chest feel tight. I've seen enough cardiac wards to know that panic never helped anyone. "Well, Helen," I said to myself, "because at my age you talk to yourself more than you'd admit. This is a new low even for this family." Half an hour earlier, we were all sitting at their dining table, my coffee cup set carefully on a coaster, so I wouldn't leave rings. There was a stack of papers between us. Carla's husband, Daniel, sat with his tablet, his sleeves rolled up like some important executive, even though I knew he hadn't had a proper job in months. "It's just a formality, Mom," Carla had said, tapping the last page. "You sign here, we handle the sale, and you don't have to worry about property taxes or leaks or shady plumbers anymore. You'll be in a nice place with nurses and activities. You like crosswords, don't you?" "I do like crosswords. I don't like being spoken to like a confused child." "This isn't a formality," I answered, tracing the printed words with my finger. My name, my address, my house. "This is a power of attorney and consent to sell. You are asking me to give you my house." "Our house, eventually," Daniel had corrected, smiling the way people smile when they're not really joking. "You said yourself you don't want to die alone there." I remember how his fingers moved over the tablet, casual, like he was already counting the money. I also remember the look in Carla's eyes. Impatience with a thin glaze of pity. That hurt more than the papers. "I'm not signing anything today," I said. My hand shook just a little as I pushed the pile away. "I'll take these home, show them to a lawyer." Something snapped in Carla's face then, just a tiny twitch, like a thread pulled too hard in a knitted sweater. "We already paid for the consultation," she hissed, forgetting her soft tone. "Daniel talked to a lawyer. It's all standard. You don't need to waste money." "It's my money," I reminded her quietly, "and my house." Her cheeks flushed. She'd never liked that, being reminded that the down payment on this very house had come from the savings her father and I scraped together all our lives. The argument rose quickly after that, voices too loud for a peaceful suburb, words we'd both regret if either of us still believed in apologizing. Daniel tried to play peacemaker for about 30 seconds, then lost his temper as well. "If you don't sign, they'll take it anyway when you end up in a facility," he said. "At least this way, it's in the family." "In the family," I repeated, feeling something go cold inside me. "Is that what you call locking your mother in a building she'll never live in?" He didn't understand. Neither of them did. They were scared. Of debt. Of losing their shiny life. Of my old body and my pills and the way time creeps up on everyone. Fear makes people cruel. I've seen it in hospital corridors and waiting rooms, and now in my own daughter. When I stood up and picked up my cane, Carla blocked the doorway. "You're not driving anywhere in this state," she said. "You're shaking. You could hurt someone." "I'll call a taxi." "No, you won't," she snapped. "You always do this, Mom. Drama, guilt, threats. I'm done. You want to act like a child? I'll treat you like one. She grabbed my arm, stronger than I remembered, and steered me toward the back door. I protested. Of course I did. But there is a point in every fight where you realize words are no longer being heard. The sun hit my eyes as we stepped outside. The air smelled of cut grass and barbecue from some neighbor's yard. Ordinary Tuesday sounds and me being marched like a prisoner. "Carla, don't you dare," I said when I saw the shed. "I'm not a dog you can lock up." "It's 5 minutes," she threw over her shoulder. "You sit, you breathe, you think. Maybe then you'll stop ruining your own future." The lock clicked from the outside. Her shadow darkened the crack at the bottom of the door for a second, then disappeared. I leaned my back against the wood, feeling every nail, every knot in the plank. My legs were trembling, partly from the arthritis, partly from the humiliation. I could have shouted. I could have kicked the door and made a scene so loud the neighbors would call the police. Instead, I took a long, slow breath and looked around. The shed slowly came into focus. Shovels, a broken lawn chair, boxes with Christmas decorations, a mower under a tarp. On a hook by the wall hung an old navy jacket I recognized. Daniel's. I'd seen him wear it when he still went into an office every morning. I reached for it more to steady myself than anything else. The fabric was dusty, the sleeve torn where it must have caught on something. As I pulled it off the hook, something heavy dropped and thudded against the wooden floor. It was a phone. Not the thin black one I'd seen on the dining table, but an older, scuffed model with a cracked corner. For a moment, I just stared at it lying there in the dust, screen dark, like a little secret that had tripped over its own feet. Then I bent down, my knees protesting, and picked it up. The case was warm from the afternoon heat and sticky with old fingerprints. I wiped the dust off the screen with my thumb. I didn't turn the phone on right away. My hands were shaking too much, and the dust in the shed made my eyes sting. I slipped it into my pocket like something fragile and dangerous and let myself breathe. Funny thing. When someone locks you in a place, all the sounds you once ignored become loud. The creak of the rafters, the soft rasp of my own breath, the throb in my joints. All of it reminded me of a life much bigger than this narrow shed. When I get scared, my mind goes backward before it goes forward. Not in scenes, not in pictures, just in truths I've carried so long they've become part of my bones. I thought of the years when my husband, Thomas, and I worked double shifts so we could pay off our house. I was a nurse. He was a postal clerk. We saved slowly, the way people used to. Coupons, jars of change, a little envelope in the back of the drawer marked "Someday." When he died, that house was mine, not because I inherited it, but because every tile, every nail had passed through our tired hands. Carla grew up in that house. She learned to walk in that hallway, scraped her knee on that porch step, slammed her door during her teenage storms. I never imagined the day she'd call it a burden. But the first time she hinted at selling it, she was already married to Daniel. She was glowing then, hopeful, ambitious, blind in the way young people are when they think money solves character. I remember Daniel arriving at our family dinners with expensive wine we didn't need and compliments that slid around the table like oil. He treated Carla like she hung the moon, and for a while, that was enough for me. Mothers want to believe their daughters have chosen well. But there were signs, even then. Questions a little too interested in my finances. Jokes a little too sharp about all that unused space in my house. At first, I laughed them off. Then I learned not to. After Thomas died, the pressure grew. Small at first, like a drip under the sink. "Mom, the roof is old. Maybe selling would save you a headache. Mom, a retirement community would be safer. Mom, we could manage the paperwork for you. And every time I said no, the air between us thinned just a bit. I helped them anyway. I gave them money for their down payment because they were starting out. I paid for Mia's preschool because they needed stability. I lent them more for a kitchen renovation because Daniel said it would raise the property value. I told myself that helping your child is what love looks like. But love, when it runs only one direction, becomes something else entirely. One year, when Carla broke her wrist, she asked me to sign a temporary power of attorney so she wouldn't deal with documents. I trusted her. I didn't imagine that piece of paper would give her ideas later, ideas Daniel would feed, shape, and press harder each year. A house paid off and sitting pretty in a good neighborhood is a tempting thing for people who believe they deserve easy lives. Standing in that shed, I heard their voices in my memory, sharper than the real sounds outside. That dinner last winter when Daniel said, "Assets sitting idle are just wasted potential." And Carla didn't correct him. The spring morning she said, "Mom, we worry about you alone in that old place." But her eyes drifted toward the appraisal letter on my counter. The slow erosion of respect, disguised as concern. My chest tightened, not with panic, but with grief. You don't raise a child expecting gratitude, but you do hope for decency, and decency should not have an expiration date. I sank onto an overturned bucket, letting the wood press into my spine. The air was thick, but I'd been in worse places. Supply closets during emergencies, basements during storms, cramped break rooms during 30-year winters. I've always known how to wait, how to think before moving. Age doesn't steal that from you. If anything, it sharpens it. I thought of Mia, my granddaughter, who still hugged me without calculation. I thought of the lilac bush behind my house that Thomas planted the year Carla was born. I thought of the cabinet where my documents were neatly filed, untouched by anyone but me. All of it reminded me that my life still belonged to me, even if my daughter had momentarily forgotten that. A wind brushed the shed walls, carrying the smell of dry leaves. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked, then quieted. Ordinary sounds. And me, an old woman, sitting calmly in a shed her daughter had locked her in, steadying her breath like she'd done for patients 1,000 times. My fingers brushed the outline of the phone in my pocket. That small, accidental weight. Daniel's jacket had been hanging there for a reason. He'd been careless enough to leave a second phone hidden from his wife, hidden from me, hidden from whoever he didn't want knowing the truth. I felt a slow, deliberate calm move through me. The phone wasn't just a secret. It was a door no lock on this shed could keep shut. I straightened my back, reached into my pocket, and this time I didn't hesitate. I pressed the power button and waited for the screen to light, dust still clinging to the edges like residue from a life lived too quickly and too sloppily. The battery icon blinked once, then the screen came to life, and in that dim shed, the glow felt almost like a match struck in a dark room. The screen lit my face with a pale glow, and for a moment I saw my reflection faintly in the cracked corner. An old woman with dust on her cheek, eyes sharp despite everything. I tapped the screen, expecting a password prompt, but the phone opened straight into Daniel's messages. A man who hides things rarely bothers with details. He counts on people not looking. Names I didn't recognize filled the top of the list. Some were saved with initials, some with emojis, some with no names at all. One thread was pinned, marked with a small red heart. I clicked it before I could think better of it. The messages weren't poetic or dramatic. They were practical, transactional, almost bored. arranging hotel rooms, complaints about money, little jokes about how family stress kept him busy. And then, deeper in the thread, a picture of Daniel in the same navy jacket that had been hanging above me minutes before, arm around a woman half his age, both of them smiling, like the world owed them comfort. I didn't feel rage, just a slow, sinking heaviness. Carla had forgiven him so much already: his lost job, his failed business attempt, the refinancing of their mortgage to invest. She always defended him, always looked tired when she did. And now, tucked between those images and words, I found a message that chilled me more than the draft slipping through the shed wall. Once her house sells, we'll be clear. You said she'll sign this week. She's too scared to live alone. Just push her. You're her daughter, she'll fold. I read it twice. My daughter. My flesh. Discussed like a tool for solving someone else's problems. And I, an obstacle to be shifted. Frightened, pressured. They didn't even bother dressing it up with sentiment. Another thread was with a contact labeled M, a man this time. The messages were short, blunt. Numbers, meeting times, warnings about overdue amounts, and investors not waiting. Words no unemployed son-in-law should have been using. When people drown in debt, they grab anything or anyone to stay afloat. I had just never expected Daniel to use Carla as his lifeline, or me as his anchor. I scrolled further. A voicemail icon blinked. I hesitated, then pressed it. Daniel's voice filled the shed, low and irritated. Carla, you need to get her to sign. I don't care how. Cry, guilt trip her, whatever works. If we don't get cash in 2 weeks, everything collapses, and I'm not taking the fall alone. I stopped the message. My hand had gone cold, the phone slick in my palm. There's a particular silence that comes after hearing a truth you didn't want, but always suspected. A silence that isn't empty, but full, echoing with everything you ignored. They had planned today. Rehearsed it maybe, the papers, the softened voices, the concern. And when I didn't bend, when the old woman didn't fold the way they counted on, Carla snapped and reached for the easiest kind of control, a locked door, and the certainty that her mother wouldn't fight back. People forget that age doesn't erase a spine. It only makes it quieter. I turned the phone over, looking at the crack along the edge. A sloppy lie hiding in a sloppy pocket. But even carelessness can become a weapon in the right hands. My thumb hovered over the home screen again. There was an email app, and a notes folder, and a photo gallery filled with screenshots of transactions I didn't understand yet. More than enough to raise questions in the right office, with the right person listening. But first, I needed to get out of that shed. And I needed to do it before Carla's temper cooled enough for her to remember she had a mother locked in the backyard. I stood, slowly, letting my knees settle under me. The shed looked different now, less like a prison and more like a temporary pause. A place where the truth had simply waited for me to pick it up. The door was solid, but the walls weren't perfect. Daniel had tried fixing the place last summer, bragging about his handyman phase, but the man couldn't hammer a nail without bending it. Along the back wall near the mower, one plank bowed inward, not by much, but enough. I pressed my palm to it. It shifted slightly under the pressure. I remembered Thomas teaching me to check for weakness in old wood. It always gives itself away, he'd say. Same as people. I pushed again, harder this time. The plank groaned. A thin beam of outside light slipped through the gap. If I could widen it just enough for my arm, maybe I could reach the latch or at least the hinge pins. I reached for a rusty trowel leaning near the chair, wedged it between the boards, and pushed. The wood resisted, then cracked, just a bit. My arms trembled, but not from age, from a kind of clarity I hadn't felt in years. There's a moment when humiliation turns into resolve. It doesn't roar. It settles. It becomes a simple truth. I am not done yet. And standing there with dust on my shoes and a stranger's phone in my pocket, I knew I wasn't. The crack in the plank widened with each push of the trowel. Not much, but enough for cold air to slip in and brush my wrist. My breath steadied as I worked. The shed wasn't built to hold anything. Not tools, not memories, and certainly not a 74-year-old woman who had spent her life lifting patients twice her size. The irony made me almost smile. The wood groaned again, louder this time, and I paused, listening for footsteps. Nothing. Just the distant hum of a lawnmower 2 houses away and the faint clatter of dishes from Carla's kitchen window. They were probably arguing. Daniel blaming her for losing her temper, Carla insisting I'd pushed her too far. They'd go in circles, as they always did, convinced they were the victims of everyone else's flaws. Neither of them would check the shed until they'd run out of things to yell at each other. I pressed harder. The plank loosened near the nail, peeling slightly from the frame. A few more minutes, and it would be enough. My back ached. But it was the kind of ache that reminded me I was still capable. Age doesn't erase strength. It just makes you choose where to spend it. When the gap was finally wide enough, I slid my arm through, feeling splinters catch on my skin. My fingers brushed the outside latch, too far to flip, but close enough to learn its weakness. The hinge pins, old, rusted, soft from years of rain. I pulled my arm back, took the trowel again, and wedged it under the bottom hinge. It took more force than I had, so I leaned my weight onto it. There was a metallic crack, small but promising. I froze again. Still no footsteps. For a moment, the fatigue hit me hard. Not physical, emotional. The kind that comes when you finally see, without denial, who your child has become. Carla wasn't cruel by nature. She was overwhelmed, scared, resentful, too used to a life she never could afford. But fear doesn't excuse locking your mother in a shed. Fear doesn't justify selling a house that isn't yours. Fear doesn't speak into voicemails about making her sign whatever it takes. I thought of her as a little girl, asleep on my chest after a nightmare. Her small fingers curled in the fabric of my blouse. I never imagined those same fingers would turn a key on me. With a slow exhale, I pushed again. The pin slid up 1 millimeter, then another. I whispered a quiet encouragement, the same way I used to talk to stubborn IV pumps during night shifts. Sometimes things move only when you coax them. Finally, with a soft clink, the pin lifted just enough for the hinge to sag. I shifted to the top hinge and repeated the process. Sweat gathered on my temple. My hands trembled from effort, not fear. When the last hinge sagged, the door tilted inward. Not fully, just loose enough for me to wedge my foot at the bottom and pull. It didn't swing open. It resisted, like everything else today. But then it gave way with a scraping sound, and I stepped out into the sunlight. For a moment, I had to close my eyes. The brightness felt violent after the dim shed. The air carried the smell of Carla's hydrangeas. She planted them because they photographed well, not because she liked their scent. The house stood silent, blinds half drawn, as if pretending nothing had happened. A neighbor's sprinkler clicked rhythmically, spraying a perfect arc over a manicured lawn. Life continued, unaware that something had shifted in me so quietly, so decisively, it didn't need an audience. I touched the phone in my pocket. Its weight steadied me. I walked along the side of the house, careful to avoid the kitchen windows. Their voices drifted faintly, Daniel's low growl, Carla's sharper replies. They didn't mention me. They assumed I was still where they'd left me. When people believe they've already won, they stop looking over their shoulders. Reaching the driveway, I moved slowly, partly because of my joints, partly because I wanted to think clearly. Leaving without confrontation wasn't cowardice, it was strategy. I'd spent a lifetime reacting, helping, soothing, rescuing. Today, I needed to act with intention. My car sat where I'd parked it earlier, a little crooked because the driveway sloped. I opened the door quietly and lowered myself into the seat. For a second, I rested my forehead on the wheel, not crying, just gathering myself. You don't walk out of a locked shed the same person who walked in. When I started the engine, the sound wasn't loud, but it echoed through me. I reversed slowly, watching the house shrink in my rearview mirror. If they heard the car, they didn't come out. At the end of the street, I finally allowed myself to breathe in full. The world outside their yard felt different, wider, steadier, a place that didn't expect me to surrender parts of myself to keep other people comfortable. I drove home without turning on the radio. Silence can be a companion when you need to think. Every few minutes, I touched the phone again, reassured by its presence like a small pulse against my palm. It wasn't just evidence. It wasn't even revenge. It was clarity. When I reached my house, the one Thomas and I built a life inside, I sat in the car for a long moment before going in. The afternoon light filtered across the porch, catching dust motes that seemed to dance in slow time. This house had held me through everything: births, deaths, disappointments, holidays that felt both too full and too empty. And now it would hold me again, but differently. Not as a refuge, as a line I would no longer let anyone cross. Inside, the air was cool and still. My cane clicked softly on the hardwood. I placed the phone on the kitchen table. Its screen glowed faintly, waiting. I wasn't rushed. Tomorrow, I'd see a lawyer. Tomorrow, I would secure what was mine. Tonight, I needed rest, water, calm. But before that, I powered on the phone again. Not to read more, to take back the part of myself that had gone quiet for far too long. I sat at the kitchen table with the second phone in front of me, its faint glow the only light in the room. Evening had settled slowly, like dust returning to shelves after being stirred. My body felt heavy, but my mind was steadier than it had been in years. There's a quiet that comes after a shock, the kind that lets you hear your own thoughts again. I opened the cabinets, took out a glass, filled it with water. My hand trembled just a little, not from fear anymore, just exhaustion. I'd spent a lifetime giving my strength away in small pieces, and today I'd used what remained with a precision I didn't know I still possessed. I returned to the table, sat down, and turned the phone over. Daniel had chosen a bland case, gray and forgettable, the kind a man picks when he doesn't want anyone asking questions. I pressed my thumb to the home button. The screen brightened again, showing the last messages I'd read. My own reflection blinked back at me, lined, tired, but alert. I began scrolling, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. If I was going to protect myself, I needed to know exactly what I was up against. Another thread caught my eye, this one labeled drafts. A strange place for messages to sit. I opened it. Inside were notes Daniel had typed but never sent. Lists of debts, names of people I didn't know, amounts that made my stomach tighten, 5 figures, 6 figures. Words like urgent, deadline, liquidate, and sprinkled between them, always, references to me. Her house clears everything. She'll sign if Carla pushes hard enough. She won't fight. She's old. I reread that last line slowly. I don't know why it was that one, out of all the filth, that stung the most. Maybe because it wasn't cruel, it was dismissive. Cruelty can at least acknowledge your strength. Dismissal erases you altogether. Still, I kept reading. I forced myself to. People think that truth breaks you, but it doesn't. Lies do. Truth bruises, yes, but it also frees. Near the bottom of the drafts folder, one note stood out. Not a list, not a plan. A message, half written. If she refuses again, we do it without her. The papers are already signed on our side. Once it's listed, she won't have the resources to fight. She's too... The sentence ended there, cut off. Maybe he'd been interrupted. Maybe even he couldn't bring himself to type the last word. Weak. Frail. Diminished. Whatever it was, it didn't matter. I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not revenge. A kind of tallness. I hadn't felt tall in years. My back ached, so I stood and walked to the living room, the cane tapping gently on the floor. From the window, I could see my porch light glowing, the one Thomas installed himself. He'd insisted on putting it on a timer so I'd never come home to darkness. I'd left it set that way all these years. Tonight, it felt like a small hand on my shoulder. Back at the table, I set the phone down and reached into my drawer for my folder of documents. Insurance papers, property records, bank statements. All intact. All mine. I turned each page carefully, just to remind myself what was still under my control. It wasn't about money. It was about boundary, dignity, the right to stand on the ground you built. Once I'd checked everything, I closed the folder and placed it beside the phone. The contrast struck me. My life, neatly documented. Daniel's life, scattered in debts and secrets. One built over decades. One collapsing under the weight of its own shortcuts. The house creaked softly as the night cooled. It was an old sound, familiar, almost comforting. I poured myself a cup of tea, chamomile, the same kind I used to make after long shifts. As the warmth spread through my hands, the events of the day began arranging themselves into something clear. A plan. In the morning, I would call the bank. Then the lawyer. Then the locksmith. Carla and Daniel had counted on my silence. My confusion. My loyalty. They had forgotten that silence is a choice, not a condition of age. Still, despite everything, a heaviness remained in my chest. Not for Daniel. He had earned his troubles. But for my daughter, the girl who once saved her allowance to buy me a cheap ceramic bird for Mother's Day, the woman who now saw me as an obstacle she was entitled to push aside. I didn't know what would become of us. Maybe nothing. Maybe something small and painful first. But that was not tonight's burden. I finished my tea, washed the cup, dried it, placed it back on the shelf. These little rituals matter when the world has shown you its teeth. They remind you of your own hands, your own agency. Before going to bed, I returned to the table one last time. I picked up the phone and took photos of the most damning messages. I emailed them to my own address, not to threaten, but to secure. To anchor the truth where it couldn't be erased. When I finally turned off the kitchen light, the house felt both enormous and safe. The kind of quiet that comes when you've survived a storm, but haven't yet told anyone. Upstairs, as I settled into bed, I let out a long breath. Not relief, not sadness. Something steadier, like the beginning of resolve. Tomorrow, my voice would return. And when it did, it would be stronger than anything they expected from a woman my age. Morning arrived quietly, the way it always does in a house where only one person wakes up. Light filtered through the curtains in thin, pale lines, and for a moment I lay still, listening. The old radiator ticked. A bird hopped along the gutter. Across the street, someone was dragging a trash bin to the curb. Ordinary sounds. But I wasn't the same woman who'd heard them yesterday. I eased myself out of bed, joints protesting in familiar ways, and padded downstairs. The phone, Daniel's phone, still sat on the kitchen table, exactly where I'd left it. A strange thing, how an object so small could change the entire direction of a life. I didn't touch it yet. There were other steps first. I made oatmeal, the plain kind. Not the flavored packets Carla always pushed on me because they were easier. When you're old, people assume ease is the highest goal. But ease is a cage if it means surrender. I ate slowly, feeling my strength gather piece by piece, like threads pulled into a tight knot. After breakfast, I put on my gray cardigan, the one with deep pockets, and slipped my documents folder inside my bag. Then I added the second phone. It felt heavier today, not physically, but in meaning, a truth I was now responsible for. I called the bank first. The young man on the line spoke quickly, as though reading from a script. But when I told him I needed to revoke all third-party permissions and freeze any pending changes, he paused, his tone shifting. Age can be an advantage when people assume you don't understand what you're doing. I was meticulous, calm, precise. By the time we ended the call, every access point that Carla and Daniel might have used was gone. Next, I phoned the lawyer who handled my will years ago. A different woman answered this time. Steady voice, confident, perhaps in her 40s. I explained only what was necessary, that I needed to update my documents, revoke any old powers of attorney, and place my home into a trust. She didn't ask why. Professionals often recognize when a question isn't a kindness, but an intrusion. "Come this afternoon," she said. "I'll clear the schedule." I thanked her and hung up. My hands were steady. Before leaving the house, I called for a taxi. I didn't trust myself to drive after such little sleep, and I didn't want Carla or Daniel to see my car missing and guess my plans. Let them stew in their assumptions a while longer. Sometimes distance is the sharpest line you can draw. The taxi arrived 10 minutes later, idling at the curb. The driver, a man around my age, helped me in with the gentleness of someone who has lived long enough to understand fragility. As we drove through town, I watched familiar streets pass by, the bakery where Thomas used to buy cherry turnovers, the library with the chipped stone steps, the large oak near the post office that had survived every storm. Small pieces of my life, unchanged, reminding me that permanence wasn't always an illusion. At the lawyer's office, I moved slowly but purposefully. The receptionist offered me water, which I accepted. When the lawyer came out to greet me, her expression softened in that subtle way people do when they sense something bruised but resolute standing in front of them. We sat in her office, surrounded by shelves heavy with binders. I opened my folder, laid out my documents, and told her, plainly, without embellishment, what needed to be done. I didn't mention the shed, or the shouting, or the humiliation. I didn't need to. My voice carried enough truth as it was. "I want my decisions to stand even if someone pressures me," I said. "I want the house protected, and I want no one, making choices on my behalf unless I give explicit permission." She nodded, taking notes. We can set all of that in motion today. I handed her the copies of the messages I'd saved, not as a weapon, as context. Her eyebrows tightened almost imperceptibly. You've been through something serious. Yes, I said. But I'm not here to fall apart. I'm here to prevent a repeat. The rest was paperwork, signatures, confirmations, careful explanations. By the time we finished, I felt lighter. Not safe yet, but on solid ground again. Outside, the air smelled of cold and exhaust. I held my bag close to my side as I waited for the taxi back home. When I finally stepped into my house again, closing the door softly behind me, a wave of tiredness washed over me. But layered within it was something steadier, almost quiet in its strength. The first steps had been taken, and for the first time in a long while, they were steps entirely my own. That afternoon, after I'd finished at the lawyer's office, I returned home with a dull ache behind my eyes. Not quite a headache, more like the weight of a truth that had been carried too long and finally put down. I brewed another pot of tea and sat by the window, letting the steam warm my face. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches, and for a moment, the house felt like it was breathing with me. I knew I needed to tell someone what had happened, not everything, not yet, but enough so that the silence wouldn't swallow me whole. There was only one person who could hear it without using it against me. My granddaughter, Mia. She was 16 now, taller than I remembered, with the same careful eyes Thomas had. A girl who noticed things, a girl who did not speak carelessly. I texted her, my thumbs stiff, slow, to ask if she could stop by after school. She replied almost instantly, "Be there around 4, Grandma." The warmth in that message steadied me more than anything I'd done at the bank or the lawyers. When she arrived, the house brightened in a way no light bulb can manage. She kicked her shoes off by the door, shrugged off her backpack, and hugged me with a softness that made something in my chest loosen. "Mom said you were upset yesterday," Mia said carefully as she settled at the table. She wouldn't tell me why. I poured her a glass of lemonade. "Your mother and I had a difficult conversation, but you don't need to carry that burden." She studied my face, not satisfied. "Grandma, I can tell something's wrong." I looked at her for a long moment. There are truths children shouldn't hear, but then there are truths that shape them, teach them how to draw their own lines one day. I chose something in between. "Someone tried to make decisions for me that weren't theirs to make," I said softly. "And I had to remind myself that I'm allowed to protect my life, even at my age." Her eyebrows knitted. "Did Mom do something?" The directness startled me, but Mia had always been sharper than her parents assumed. I reached for her hand. "Your mother is overwhelmed. Your father has made choices she feels she must support. That doesn't excuse anything, but it explains enough for now." Mia looked down. "They fight a lot," she whispered. "Mom cries in her car sometimes. I've seen her." A soft pain crept up my throat. For all Carla had done, she was still someone's mother too, and failing at that role must have weighed on her like wet wool. I squeezed Mia's fingers gently. "I'm not angry with you, and none of this is your fault. You hear me?" She nodded, then glanced at the table where my documents were neatly stacked. "Are you doing paperwork?" "Mom hates paperwork." "I'm updating a few things," I said, "to make sure my house stays safe, and to make sure you're cared for in the ways that matter." Her eyes widened slightly. She understood more than I intended, but not too much. That was enough. "Grandma," she said slowly, "if Mom is doing something wrong, can I help?" There was sincerity in her voice, Not meddling, not curiosity, just concern. She was young, but she wasn't naive. You help simply by being you, I said. And by knowing I'm all right. I didn't tell her about the shed, or the phone, or the drafts and debts, and the way fear can twist people into shapes they no longer recognize. Some truths were too heavy for a girl still learning who she was. But I did tell her something else, something more important. When people try to take something from you, I said quietly, you don't have to fight with fists or shouting. Sometimes you fight by knowing exactly who you are and what you will not give up. She absorbed that with a seriousness far beyond her years. We spent the next hour talking about school, her art projects, a boy she insisted wasn't a boyfriend but blushed when she said his name. I let the warmth of her fill the house, mend the small internal cracks. When she finally stood to leave, she hugged me again, longer this time. Grandma, she murmured, if you ever need me, even if Mom gets mad, just call. My throat tightened, but I kept my voice steady. I know, sweetheart. And I hope you never have to see the parts of adulthood that make people hard. After she left, the house grew quiet again, but not empty. Her presence lingered like sunlight on a wall long after the window has closed. I went to the kitchen, picked up the second phone, and placed it in the drawer beside my documents. Not hidden, just contained. A fact among other facts. There was still a long road ahead. Conversations to be had. Lines to be drawn. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel alone. And that, at my age, is a kind of strength no one can take. For the rest of the evening, the house felt almost too still, as if it were watching me, waiting to see what I would do next. I moved through the rooms slowly, checking windows, straightening a picture frame, folding a blanket over the arm of the sofa. Small rituals that reminded me the space was mine, not something to be negotiated or bargained away. Around 9, I finally sat down at the dining table with the second phone in front of me. I hadn't opened it since placing it in the drawer earlier, but I knew I couldn't leave things half done. Truth loses its sharp edge when handled timidly. So I powered it on, and the screen lit up again, that same cracked glow. This time, I opened the email app. There were unsent drafts there, too. Daniel must have been more disorganized than I ever gave him credit for. One draft contained a photo of my house taken from the street, along with a message addressed to a real estate agent. A note at the bottom read, "Ready to list. Just need her signature. We'll handle this week." My name wasn't even mentioned. Not once. I felt a cold calm settle over me, like a blanket of snow covering everything sharp. Sometimes anger is too small for what you feel. Sometimes you reach a place past it, where only clarity remains. Another email draft was addressed to someone named Greg. The message was shorter, rougher. Funds coming. Don't call again. Wife is on board. Old lady will sign. He hadn't even bothered to mask the contempt. I read every line, not rushing, letting each piece slide into place. Patterns form when you stop turning away from them, and here the pattern was painfully simple. Desperation, secrecy, entitlement. A man drowning who thought he had a right to push others under just to keep his own head above water. My hands were steady as I forwarded the most relevant emails to my own inbox. I didn't need all of them, just enough to protect myself if things escalated. I saved the drafts to a folder labeled House. A simple word, but one that, tonight, felt like a declaration. When I finished, the room was quiet again. Too quiet. Night has a way of amplifying every small sound. The hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of wind through the window screens, the soft rhythm of my own breathing. I stood and walked to the living room, turning on a small lamp. The warm light softened the corners of the room and made the old wooden floors glow. I sat down slowly, my back sinking into the familiar curve of my favorite armchair. I had bought that chair the year Thomas died, not because I needed new furniture, but because I needed something in the house that didn't carry the shape of his absence. Funny how grief teaches you the geometry of empty spaces. As I rested there, I thought about what tomorrow would bring. The real confrontation hadn't begun yet. Carla would call at some point, angry, concerned, maybe performatively worried. Her patterns were predictable. First the soft voice, then the guilt, then the cutting remarks about how hard she tries. And behind her, always, Daniel, pulling at strings she didn't even realize he'd tied around her wrists. But today, I had shifted something. Quietly, privately, but undeniably. Around 10, my phone buzzed. My phone, not Daniel's. A text from Carla. "Mom, are you home?" I tried calling earlier. "Can we talk tomorrow?" There was no apology, no explanation, just a line thrown into the air, hoping I'd catch it out of habit. But habit is not loyalty. Habit is what remains when respect is gone. I didn't reply. Not out of spite, but out of choice. Silence can be a boundary when words are wasted. I set the phone down, turned off the lamp, and let the house settle back into darkness. Tonight, rest was part of the work. A tired mind makes mistakes, and I needed all the clarity I could muster. I climbed the stairs slowly, one hand on the railing. My knees complained, as they always did at the end of a long day, but even that felt different, like a body reminding me it had carried me through much worse. In my bedroom, the sheets were cool, the pillows familiar. As I lay down, I felt the weight of the day press into the mattress beside me, not crushing, just present, like a reminder that I had stepped into a different chapter of my life without ceremony or fanfare. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. There would be decisions to make soon, conversations to endure, lines to draw so sharply they could not be erased. But not tonight. Tonight, the most important thing I could do was sleep in a house that was still mine, on land that held every story I'd ever lived. And for the first time in a long while, sleep came easily. I woke before dawn, the kind of waking where you're already thinking before your eyes open. The house was still wrapped in darkness, the kind that feels softer than night, almost protective. I stayed in bed a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the heater and the faint rustle of branches outside. My body ached in familiar ways, but my mind felt anchored. Today wasn't about fear or reaction. It was about securing the truth, carefully, methodically, like a nurse preparing a patient chart before a difficult procedure. I went downstairs, made coffee, and sat at the table with both phones in front of me. The difference between them struck me. Mine, scratched but honest. His, cracked and full of shadows. But shadows are useful if you know how to read them. I turned on Daniel's phone and opened the gallery again. There were screenshots I hadn't saved yet. Bank apps, loan notices, messages with timestamps at strange hours. Nothing explosive on its own, but together, they painted a picture he'd spent years trying to hide. I scrolled slowly, not to feed anger, but to gather facts. Facts have a way of steadying you when emotions want to run wild. One image stopped me. A photo of my own front door. Taken recently. Early morning light slanting across the steps. My heart tightened, not in fear, but in recognition. He had stood there, close enough to reach the handle, close enough to imagine the house already his. The arrogance of it settled over me like dust. Still, I saved the image. Evidence isn't vengeance, it's protection. When the clock touched 7, I called the bank again, this time asking for written confirmation of every restriction placed on my accounts. The woman on the phone sounded surprised at my precision. People expect confusion from someone my age. Clarity startles them. She promised the documents would be emailed within the hour. Next, I called a locksmith. A simple request: change every lock in the house by the end of the day. The man said he could come around noon. I felt something in my chest loosen at that. Locks aren't symbolic. They're practical. And practicality is what saves people when symbolism fails. By 8, sunlight filled the kitchen. I felt steady enough to look again at the messages to Daniel's contact, Greg. One stood out. If the listing falls through, I'm done. They'll take the rest. She's stubborn, but she'll give in. It was dated only 2 weeks ago. Not old desperation, fresh. Resentment crept up my spine, but I didn't let it settle. I refused to let their panic decide the tone of my day. Instead, I drafted a simple email to myself. I attached the screenshots and forwarded the messages, making sure everything existed somewhere Daniel couldn't erase. Once done, I placed the second phone gently on the table. I realized then that the fear I had felt in the shed wasn't present anymore. It had burned out, leaving something steadier behind it. Self-respect, maybe. Or the memory of it. Around 9:30, the doorbell rang softly. For a moment, I thought it might be Carla. The thought tightened my breath, not because I dreaded her anger, but because I dreaded the version of her that anger created. But when I opened the door, it was only the mailman with a small stack of envelopes. I thanked him and closed the door again, grateful for the normalcy. Back at the table, I laid the envelopes beside the phones and let the quiet stretch around me. There was no rush, no looming threat. Only the slow unfolding of a day I finally controlled. I brewed more coffee, leaned back in my chair, and allowed myself a rare moment of ease. Not joy, ease. They're different. Joy sparkles. Ease settles. As I sipped, I felt something shift internally. Small, but unmistakable. For months, maybe years, I had lived in a tightening circle without realizing it, shrinking my comfort, my voice, my expectations so Carla and Daniel wouldn't snap. But circles don't shrink on their own. People shrink them for you. Today, I widened mine again. I powered off the second phone and placed it inside a plain envelope. Not hidden, not buried, just contained, like a sharp tool kept safely in a drawer until it's needed. Then I looked around my kitchen, at the sunlight warming the cupboards, at the quiet hum of my own life. This house had held storms before. It would hold this one too. And for the first time in many years, I felt entirely, solidly prepared. The quiet of the late morning didn't last. It never does when trouble knows your name. Around 11, my phone buzzed twice. Carla. I watched her name glow on the screen but didn't touch it. A minute later, a voicemail icon appeared. I let it sit. Stillness is a form of power when someone expects you to panic. I finished washing the breakfast dishes before I finally pressed play, letting her voice spill into the room. Mom, can you call me back? Please? I don't know what happened yesterday. Daniel said you were upset, but I don't understand why you left without talking to us. Anyway, please call. It's important. There was a tremor in her voice, but not quite guilt. more the unease of someone who senses a consequence forming in the distance. I deleted the voicemail and set the phone aside. Important, she had said, as if the importance of anything in my life still depended on her instructions. Not long after, the doorbell rang sharply. 3 quick presses, the kind people use when they believe they have a right to enter before being invited. I looked through the peephole. Daniel. His shoulders were squared, his jaw tight, the expression of a man preparing to manage a situation rather than apologize for one. A version of him I recognized all too well. I opened the door only halfway. He forced a smile, the kind stretched too thin to hide its impatience. Helen, glad you're home. We were worried. We? I asked. He cleared his throat. Carla's shaken. You leaving like that? It wasn't safe. The urge to laugh rose unexpectedly, not amusement, but disbelief at how effortlessly lies came to him. Locking someone in a shed isn't safe either, I said mildly. But safety didn't seem to be your priority yesterday. A flicker crossed his face, quickly replaced by practiced concern. That was a misunderstanding. Carla told me what happened. She was overwhelmed, and when you refused to sign— I didn't refuse, I interrupted. I chose. There's a difference. His eyes sharpened at the word chose. People like Daniel prefer their elderly in past tense, managed, dependent, predictable. My calm unsettled him more than anger would have. He shifted his weight. Look, Helen, we need to clear this up. Those documents weren't dangerous. You should have talked to us before running off. I did talk, I said. You just didn't listen. He inhaled sharply, irritation cracking through the veneer. All right, fine, but we need the paperwork back. Those are legal documents. They're illegal in intent, I corrected. And they are with my lawyer now. His posture froze. For the first time, something like fear flickered in his eyes. Not fear of me, but of exposure. Your lawyer? He repeated slowly. Yes, I said. Since you and Carla felt free to arrange one for me without my consent, I thought it wise to choose my own. He tried to recover. We were just trying to help. We thought you'd want— You thought my house was your solution, I said, my voice calm, even. And you assumed I wouldn't notice. A beat of silence passed, thick as wet cloth. He glanced toward the driveway as if calculating his next move, then lowered his voice. Helen, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Some of the things you may have seen or heard, Carla was emotional. She said things she didn't mean. I'm not talking about her words, I said quietly. He blinked. The stillness between us sharpened. I reached into my cardigan pocket, pulled out the plain envelope containing his second phone, and held it where he could see the shape of it without revealing the device itself. His face drained in a single exhale. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. You left something in the shed, I said. His throat bobbed. Helen, whatever you think. I don't think, I replied. I read. He took a half step forward, but I closed the door another inch, enough to remind him whose threshold he stood on. We can explain, he whispered. Some of those messages are archived, I said, and duplicated. They are not negotiable. Panic softened his voice. Do you plan to destroy our family over this? I looked at him, really looked. A man cornered not by me, but by his own choices. Families are destroyed by actions, I said softly. Not by the truth about them. For a long second, neither of us moved. Then he stepped back, defeated in a way I'd never seen. Carla will call, he muttered. She wants to fix this. She will have to fix herself first, I said. He turned away, shoulders tight, and walked down the path to his car without another word. When he drove off, gravel crackled under the tires like brittle bones. I closed the door fully, slid the deadbolt into place, and stood there with my hand resting against the wood. The house felt different. Not safer, not yet, but steadier. Like a structure rediscovering its own foundation after years of pressure. I walked back to the kitchen, sat at the table, and let the quiet settle around me. It wasn't victory. It wasn't triumph. It was the beginning of being heard again. For a long time after Daniel's car disappeared down the street, I didn't move. I stood by the door with my palm resting on the cool wood, breathing slowly until my pulse settled. It wasn't fear that lingered in me. It was the realization that something irreversible had shifted. Once a truth is spoken aloud, even softly, it cannot be folded back into silence. I walked to the living room and sat in my chair, letting the house settle back around me. The radiators hissed faintly. The clock ticked in its steady rhythm. Ordinary sounds, but they felt different now, like witnesses rather than background. An hour passed before the phone rang again. Carla, this time. I let it ring until voicemail picked up. Her message was longer than Daniel's, her voice strained and brittle. Mom, I just talked to Daniel. He said you're upset over something you found. I don't understand any of this. Can you please just talk to me? I don't want things to get worse. There was a pause long enough for a breath that almost broke. Please call me back. I listened to the message twice, not because I needed clarification, but because I needed to hear the way her certainty had finally cracked. Not out of spite, just recognition. When people build their lives on the belief that you will always yield, the moment you stop is an earthquake. I deleted the message and spent the next hour sorting a small stack of papers on the table. There was nothing urgent among them: a utility bill, a charity newsletter, a reminder from my doctor. But handling them gave my hands something to do as my thoughts settled into place. By early afternoon, the locksmith arrived. A quiet man, older than I expected, with gentle eyes and the patience of someone who has listened to many stories he never asked for. He didn't ask for mine. He simply replaced each lock methodically, explaining the new keys only when necessary. When he finished, he handed me a small envelope containing spares. Make sure these go to people you trust, he said. And only them. I nodded. The weight of the new keys in my palm felt almost ceremonial. Not long after he left, gravel crunched outside again. I didn't need to look to know who it was. Carla always drove into a moment rather than walking into it. The doorbell rang, not urgently, but insistently. I opened the door halfway, the chain still in place. She stood on the porch, looking smaller than I remembered. Shoulders tense, makeup smudged, the kind of weariness that no amount of sleep ever solves. Mom, she said, exhaling as if she had been holding her breath for hours. Can we talk, please? I kept my hand on the doorframe. Talking didn't seem to help yesterday. Her eyes flicked downward. Shame, or the closest thing to it. I know. What I did was wrong. I shouldn't have locked you in there. Her voice shook on the last words, though whether from regret or fear I couldn't tell. I don't know what came over me. Everything feels like it's falling apart, and I panicked. Panic is no excuse, but it is a reason. I let her explanation rest in the air without comforting it. You made a choice, I said. And choices have consequences. She swallowed. Daniel said you took something of his. A phone. Did he tell you what was on it? I asked. Her face tightened. He said it was private, that you misunderstood things. Then he didn't tell you, I replied. A long pause stretched between us. Wind moved through the porch railings, lifting a strand of her hair. She looked older, not in years but in spirit, worn down by someone else's storms. Finally, she said, "Mom, can I come in?" The hope in her voice was thin and trembling. "No," I said gently. "Not today." She blinked, stunned. "So you're shutting me out?" "I'm setting a boundary," I said. "Something I should have done years ago." "I'm your daughter," she whispered. "And I am your mother," I answered. "Not a resource you can pressure, not a problem you can solve through force, and not a possession tied to your marriage." The truth landed between us like a quiet stone. She wrapped her arms around herself. "What are you going to do with the phone?" "What I need to protect myself," I said. "I won't use it to hurt you unless you leave me no choice. But I won't pretend ignorance anymore." Tears rimmed her eyes, but she didn't cry. Carla never cried in front of witnesses. That was something she learned from her father. "Daniel said you talked to a lawyer," she said, with a faint trace of dread. "I did." "And? What did you change?" "Everything that needed changing," I answered. "My home is no longer yours to discuss. My finances are secured, and any authority you once had over my decisions is gone." She closed her eyes for a moment, the truth hitting her in full. When she opened them again, her voice was softer, scraped, raw. "I didn't mean for it to get this bad." "I know," I said, "but intention doesn't erase impact." For a moment, she looked like the girl she once was, hurt, confused, reaching for something she could no longer name. But adulthood is not childhood, and apologies do not erase harm. They merely acknowledge it. "I need time," I said. She nodded slowly. "Will you call me?" "When I'm ready," I said. "Not before." She stepped back from the door, defeated but not dismissed. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll wait." I closed the door gently, not in anger, but in finality, and stayed there with my hand on the wood until I felt steady again. The house was quiet, but not the frightened quiet of the shed. It was the quiet of a boundary held, a life reclaimed inch by inch. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of my own authority settle comfortably on my shoulders, like it had been waiting for me to pick it up again. The house stayed still long after Carla's footsteps faded down the path, as if it were holding its breath with me. I moved slowly through the rooms, not because I was tired, but because I needed to feel each space again, to remind myself that nothing inside these walls belonged to anyone but me. The new locks clicked solidly when I tested them, a small, reassuring sound. I brewed a cup of tea, though I barely tasted it. My hands were steady, but there was a tremor somewhere inside me, not of fear, but of the gravity of what had begun. Lines, once drawn, don't erase themselves. By late afternoon, the winter light had thinned, stretching long shadows across the floor. I sat down at my desk with the second phone beside me, the envelope partially open. I didn't take the device out yet. Instead, I opened my laptop and checked my email. The bank had already sent confirmation of the lockouts and restrictions I'd placed. The lawyer had followed with a packet outlining the trust changes and the official revocation of every authority Carla once held. Seeing it all in writing felt like exhaling after years of holding my breath. I was reviewing the documents when the phone vibrated. Daniel's phone, not mine. The name on the screen read Megan. I let it ring. When it stopped, a message appeared. Where are you? That guy came by again. Call me. Something inside me chilled. Not because of the affair, that was Daniel's own poison to drink, but because his desperation was bleeding into every corner of his life. Whatever debts he'd hidden had begun knocking on doors that weren't mine or Carla's. I copied the message, forwarded it to my email, then finally powered the device off again. I had all I needed. I went to the living room, though sitting still proved impossible. My mind wandered to Mia, her cautious eyes, the way she squeezed my hand before leaving yesterday. She was the only one who hadn't tried to use me as leverage. The trust would protect her one day, not with money alone, but with the knowledge that someone in her life had chosen her out of love rather than obligation. I hoped, when the time came, she would understand why I made these choices without bitterness toward her mother. As the evening grew colder, I finally lit a small lamp and settled into my chair. The silence around me felt honest, not empty. My cane rested against the armrest. The keys to the new locks sat in a neat row on the coffee table, and for the first time in years, nothing in the room made me feel vulnerable. There was strength in that, a strength I had mistaken for loneliness once. Now it felt like freedom. Around 7, my phone buzzed again. Carla. Not calling this time, texting. Her message was longer. I talked to Daniel. He's upset. I'm trying to hold everything together. Please, Mom, tell me what you want from us. Do you want space? Do you want to punish us? I don't understand what you're doing. I read it carefully, twice, before setting the phone down. Carla still saw everything through the lens of her own crisis. She wanted instructions, a clear path back to the ease she believed she was owed. But adulthood doesn't come with shortcuts, and love doesn't come with conditions that erase wrongdoing. I didn't answer. Silence was my boundary for now. A spoken explanation would only invite debate, persuasion, arguments crafted to pull me back into a role I no longer intended to play. The truth was simple. I didn't want anything from them. I wanted my dignity back, and I had already taken it. Outside, a car door slammed, and I stiffened until I heard the neighbor's dog bark. Just ordinary life, moving forward without concern for mine. I allowed myself a small breath of relief. The day had been long, but it had remained mine from start to finish. That alone felt like victory. Before going upstairs, I checked the locks one more time, not out of fear, but habit. Old women are allowed habits. We've earned them. Then I folded the envelope with the second phone inside and placed it in my desk drawer. Not hidden, not displayed, simply kept. A quiet sentinel. When I finally settled into bed, the house creaked its familiar night sounds, the walls expanding and settling, the wind brushing the siding. Things I had heard for decades, but tonight they felt like allies rather than warnings. I lay there with the blankets tucked around my shoulders and let myself acknowledge the truth. The real storm wasn't over. It was only gathering. But for the first time, I wasn't bracing for it with fear. I was preparing for it with intention, and that made all the difference. The next morning arrived with a hard frost on the lawn, a thin white crust that gave the world a muted stillness. I stood at the kitchen window with my hands wrapped around a warm mug, watching the breath of winter settle over the neighborhood. Everything looked clean, untouched, as if the earth itself had drawn a boundary overnight. I found comfort in that, a small echo of what I had begun to do for myself. I spent the early hours moving slowly through the house, dusting shelves, watering plants, folding laundry that didn't need folding. There is a rhythm to tending a home, and I let that rhythm steady me. But beneath each action lived an awareness that something inside me had changed in a way I couldn't undo. I no longer felt the old familiar ache of waiting for a phone call or an apology or a moment of softness from Carla. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing myself for her mood or Daniel's tone or the unpredictable weather of their marriage. The stillness inside me was earned. Around late morning, I slipped on my coat and walked down the steps to check the mailbox. The cold bit at my cheeks, but it felt honest. Real. Halfway down the path, I saw my neighbor, Linda, sweeping her porch. She raised a hand. I raised mine. We didn't talk. We rarely did more than exchange small greetings. But today, the ordinary gesture soothed me. It reminded me that my life stretched beyond Carla's crises, Daniel's deceptions, and the long shadow of their expectations. I was part of a world that existed without them. After lunch, I decided to drive to the small community center I used to visit years ago. They held afternoon gatherings, knitting groups, book clubs, low-impact exercise classes for older adults. I hadn't gone in a long while, partly because Carla insisted I shouldn't push myself, and partly because I'd grown into the habit of shrinking my life to make hers feel bigger. Today, I felt no need to shrink. The center was warm when I stepped inside, the hall buzzing with quiet conversation and the soft thrum of an old radio playing standards from the 70s. A few familiar faces greeted me with that pleasant surprise people feel when someone they assumed had faded away steps back into the room. I joined a small circle of women knitting scarves for a winter charity drive. My hands were stiff at first, the yarn awkward between my fingers, but muscle memory returned eventually. The chatter around me, gentle complaints about arthritis, jokes about grandchildren, murmured updates about doctor visits, felt grounding. These women had weathered storms of their own. None of us needed to impress one another with our resilience. We simply sat, needles clicking, lives unfolding quietly beside each other. At one point, a woman named Nora leaned over and said, "Haven't seen you here in ages, Helen. Everything all right?" I considered lying or brushing it off, but something inside me refused to shrink back into old patterns. "Life got complicated," I said. "I'm uncomplicating it now." She nodded with a knowing look, as if she had lived through her own version of a daughter who took too much or a son-in-law who mistook kindness for weakness. I didn't need to explain further. The older you get, the more people understand without asking. I stayed for almost 2 hours, letting the simple companionship loosen knots inside me I didn't know were there. When I finally drove home, the winter sun was already lowering, tinting the sky in a pale gold that seemed to soften the whole world. I parked in my driveway and sat in the car for a few minutes, letting the silence settle again. For once, I didn't fear returning to an empty house. It felt like mine in a way it hadn't for years. Inside, I made a small dinner, soup, toast, and ate while reading a few pages of a novel I'd abandoned months ago. My attention drifted often, but not from worry, from peace. The kind of peace that grows slowly, like moss, when you stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. Later that evening, as I was preparing for bed, I passed the drawer where the second phone lay. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Its presence no longer felt like a threat or a burden. It was simply a fact, a tool, a piece of truth waiting for the right moment. I brushed my teeth, washed my face, changed into my nightgown, and turned down the covers. As I settled into bed, the house creaked in its familiar, gentle way. For the first time in a long while, I felt not like someone bracing for harm, but like someone reclaiming her place in the world, one quiet, steady breath at a time. I turned off the light and let the darkness settle around me. Not heavy, not ominous, but comforting, like a soft hand over my own. Tomorrow would come, and I would meet it fully. 2 days passed before Carla tried again. I had expected her silence to stretch longer, but desperation has a way of bending time. On the third morning, just as I finished making my oatmeal, I saw her car pull into the driveway. Not hastily, not with the sharp impatience she usually carried, but slowly, as if she were approaching a house that no longer belonged to her version of the world. I watched from the kitchen window for a moment before opening the door. This time, I didn't feel the old tension tighten my shoulders. The boundaries were already drawn. Today would simply test their strength. She stood on the porch, bundled in a coat she hadn't bothered to zip. The cold had flushed her cheeks, and her hair was pulled back in a way that made her look younger and somehow more fragile. "Mom," she said, voice low, almost hushed. "Can we talk? Please?" There was no demand in her tone, no entitlement, only weariness. I stepped aside, leaving the doorway open but not inviting with words. She entered tentatively, like someone stepping into a room after a long absence. Once inside, she stared at my living room. The neatness of it, the absence of her influence, the small signs of a life she didn't visit often enough to understand. Some realizations don't require speech. We sat opposite each other at the kitchen table. She wrapped her hands around her own elbows as if holding herself together. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I let her take whatever time she needed. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red but dry. "Daniel's in trouble," she said quietly. "Real trouble." I didn't respond. She searched my face for sympathy and, finding none, continued. "He told me about the debts. At least some of them. He said he had things under control, but he doesn't. People have been calling. Someone came to his office. And when he realized the house, your house, wouldn't be sold." Her voice cracked. "He blames me. He says I failed him." Her words didn't surprise me. Men who build their lives on shifting sand often look for someone else to sink with them. But it hurt to see my daughter sitting there, holding the sharp edges of decisions she hadn't made alone. I folded my hands on the table. "Carla, you didn't fail him. You enabled him, and you allowed him to shape your fears into tools." "That's not fair," she whispered. "It's honest," I replied. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them with a steadiness that reminded me of the girl she once was, the one who used to sit with me during storms, trying to pretend she wasn't afraid. "I need to understand something," she said. "Why now? You've forgiven me for so many things. You've let things slide. You've carried so much for me. Why did it all change this time?" I took my time answering. "When you speak of pain that has ripened over years, you don't rush. Because you locked me in a shed," I said plainly. "Because you spoke to me as if I were an obstacle. Because you forgot I am a person with a life, not a storage box you can open and close. And because for the first time, I saw myself through your eyes." I shook my head slowly. I didn't like the view. She flinched, the truth landing with the weight it deserved. But instead of anger, something softer passed over her. Recognition, maybe, or the first fragile seed of remorse. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Not dramatic, not forced. Just a small, sincere offering. "I hear you," I said. "But apology isn't repair. Repair is choosing differently." Her gaze lowered. What if I don't know how? That, I said gently, is the first honest thing you've said to me in years. She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. I don't want to lose you. You haven't, I said. But you don't own me, Carla. That's the difference. Silence filled the kitchen again, but it wasn't hostile. It was the kind of silence that appears when two people finally stop performing and start seeing one another clearly. She looked at the drawer where the second phone was kept, though I hadn't touched it. Her voice softened further. Are you going to use it? Against him? I will use what I must to protect myself, I said, but not to destroy him. His own actions will take care of that. She nodded slowly, as if absorbing a truth she had long resisted. Mom, I don't know what happens next, between you and me. We take it one choice at a time, I said, and you stop trying to fix your panic by controlling other people. Especially me. Her face crumpled in a way I hadn't seen since she was a child, a look not of weakness, but of someone finally understanding the cost of the life she'd been living. She stood, hesitated, and then, very gently, placed her hand over mine. Her touch was trembling, almost weightless. Thank you for letting me in today, she said. I didn't squeeze her hand back. Not out of coldness, but because some gestures must be earned in time, not taken in the moment. She understood. She withdrew without hurt. Before she left, she paused at the door and turned slightly. I'm trying, she whispered. I know, I replied. Try for yourself this time, not for him. She nodded once, stepped into the cold air, and closed the door softly behind her. The house exhaled with me. I leaned against the doorframe, tired but lighter, not forgiven, not healed, but mending in the quiet, steady way that older women learn to do, slowly, deliberately, without expecting applause. What came next would not be easy, but for the first time, it felt possible. The day after Carla's visit, a soft rain began falling before sunrise, the kind that barely makes a sound, yet brings a heaviness to the air. I woke early and went downstairs, letting the familiar creak of each step remind me that this house had held me through every season of my life: joy, grief, disappointment, and now this curious, quiet reclamation of myself. The kettle whistled gently, and I made tea, then carried it to the living room where the window fogged with condensation. Outside, the world blurred, softened, as if asking for a slower gaze. I took that as permission. By late morning, I decided to make a simple stew, something warm enough to fill the house with a steady comfort. While it simmered, I set a place for one at the table, then paused and added a second. Not out of loneliness, out of possibility. I didn't expect Carla to come, but I didn't dread the idea anymore either. There's a difference between waiting and welcoming, and today I felt neither. I was simply living. Mia arrived first, without text or warning, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She stepped inside and inhaled deeply. It smells like home, she said, smiling in that way teenagers do when they still allow themselves moments of softness. She sat at the table, pulling out a small sketchbook. Can I draw here for a bit? Mom said she might come later. You're always welcome, I said, and meant it. She sketched quietly while I ladled stew into bowls. The house warmed, the windows fogged further, and something inside me eased at the sight of her. Steady, gentle, unbroken by the turbulence around her. When she handed me her finished drawing, a simple pencil study of my hands holding a mug, I felt a ripple of tenderness that surprised me. You have your grandfather's eye, I told her. She nodded, pleased. An hour later, the doorbell rang. This time I didn't check the peephole. I simply opened it. Carla stood there, hair damp from rain, face pale but composed. She held no papers, no demands, no explanations. Only a small container of rolls from the bakery she knew I liked. "I brought these," she said quietly. If that's all right." "It is," I said, stepping aside. She entered slowly, noticing Mia before anything else. The girl offered her a small, cautious smile. Carla touched her daughter's shoulder lightly, then looked at me. There was gratitude in her expression. Small, restrained, but real. We ate in near silence at first. Not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. 3 women at one table, each carrying her own version of the past weeks. As we finished, Carla set her fork down and met my eyes with a steadiness she hadn't shown in a long time. "I've spoken to a counselor," she said, "and I told them everything. About the pressure, the debts, the fear, about how I treated you." She swallowed. "I didn't justify anything. I just told the truth." I let her words settle. Confession is not absolution, but it is a door cracked open. She continued, "I don't know what my life with Daniel will look like. Maybe nothing, maybe too much. But I want my life with you to be something better than it's been." Mia watched her mother with a quiet hope that tightened my chest. Children always hope before adults dare to. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Carla added. "I'm asking for the chance to earn it." I breathed slowly. Years of hurt pressed against my ribs, but they didn't crush me the way they once did. Age doesn't dull pain, it teaches proportion. "We can try," I said, "but not by pretending nothing happened." "I know," she whispered. "I don't want to pretend anymore." We cleared the table together, an act so simple it felt almost ceremonial. When they left later that afternoon, the rain had stopped, and a faint light stretched through the clouds. I watched them walk to the car, mother and daughter, talking softly, steps matching without effort. A small, quiet hope flickered in me, not for a perfect future, but for one in which none of us remained trapped in old roles. After they drove away, I locked the door, not out of fear, but habit. I went to my desk, opened the drawer, and touched the envelope containing the second phone. I didn't remove it. I didn't need to. Its purpose had already been served. It wasn't a threat now. It was simply truth, preserved and no longer burning. I returned to the living room, sat in my favorite chair, and watched the last of the clouds drift apart. The house felt warm around me, not from the stew or the heat, but from the quiet certainty that my life, my choices, my voice, belonged to me again. And if any woman reading this has forgotten the weight of her own voice, the strength of her own boundaries, let this be your reminder. Reclaim them. Carefully, quietly, fiercely if you must, but reclaim them.